Welcome to the Bluffton Biblecast, where together we embark on an apocalyptic adventure through the prophets and Revelation. Though it's a daunting task, we encourage you to embrace the challenge and find captivating truths from the mysterious parts of God's Word. Thanks for joining us. I'm Jamie Steffen, and once again, I'm joined with Todd Dreyer, Steve Ringer, and Carter Fichter as editor. This week, we are reading Zechariah 5 through 9.
Hey, Steve, since it's an election week, let's start off with a political question. What do you think about the separation of church and state?
Todd, what a strange question to start off with the Biblecast. I mean, I kind of like it. I like my political leaders separate from my spiritual leaders. It seems like there's less corruption in a church that way.
Yeah, I kind of agree. Did you know that this week's reading discusses this?
Really? I don't remember seeing that in the Bible.
Well, actually, it isn't. But Zechariah refers to the opposite, the blending of church and state. In chapter 6, God instructs Zechariah to put a crown on the head of Joshua, and Joshua is the high priest.
So they crowned the high priest rather than the actual leader?
Yeah, the passage equates the high priest with a king, so a priest king.
Okay, a priest king. Why do we care if there is a priest king?
Well, Jamie, it is a concept that the Bible brings out in several places, starting with Melchizedek. But ultimately, Jesus is the most obvious example of a priest king.
And why is the priest king concept important?
Yeah, good question, Jamie. A king is typically a ruler that relies on the power of the people to accomplish things. If he fights a war, he uses his people as his soldiers, tax money from his people to fund the war, and he gives commands that people have to follow in order to win the war. But a priest, he is a servant of the people, a person who intercedes to God for them. While the priest is a leader, his primary job is to serve the people in regards to their standing with God, not to rule over them.
And that is why this concept is so revolutionary. They are typically very different roles.
Yeah, human leadership seems to blend these two roles very badly. A self-sacrificing leader seems impossibly inconsistent with a king.
And here is where Jesus stands out. He is our king. He rules, asks for our allegiance, our submission, and our lives.
But
first, he acted as priest, taking our sin on himself and making us righteous at his own expense.
yes, the perfect priest king.
Yes, this is the ultimate blending of church and state, but in an amazing way.
And so this passage regarding a priest king seems to prophesy about Jesus by discussing the branch in chapter 6, verses 11 through 14. Jamie, could you recap those verses for us?
Sure. This coming branch will build the temple, rule from the throne with a council of peace, but also be a priest on the throne.
Jesus the branch.
Yes, Todd, but isn't the branch strange terminology for Jesus? It's referring to a tree.
It is, Steve. But really, who are we to say that tree terminology sounds strange? I mean, have you ever heard of putting down roots, or can't see the forest for the trees, or the apple doesn't fall far from the tree?
I guess we have our share of tree terminology.
Yes, agreed. And this tree terminology didn't start in Zechariah. Remember all the way back to the beginning of Isaiah 11. It says, "There shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, and a branch from his roots shall bear fruit, and the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him."
Jeremiah 23 also mentions a righteous branch who will reign as a king in righteousness.
Yeah, the ESV Study Bible describes it in this way. After Israel the tree has been chopped down and destroyed, the coming Messiah will be a shoot that comes from the stump of Israel and will grow and will branch out to rule.
And that branch we know as Jesus. I read that a delegation came from Bethel and went to Zechariah and the priests to ask regarding fasts and the need for their continuation.
Yeah, I remember reading about their question, but I didn't see a clear response coming from Zechariah.
You know, Todd, I remember back in the day when our teenage boys would ask a simple question that needed a conversation, not a straight answer, to help them see at a deeper level what was really at play. This was one of those moments for Zechariah. The people needed some teaching and redirection, and their question was a great opportunity for God to share his heart. This was done in 4 responses, all starting with the word of the Lord, or the Lord said.
How did God direct Zechariah to answer the question?
Well, God answered them a question in response to their question. He asked, "When you fasted, did you do it for me or yourselves?" wanting them to see that their fasts were merely empty rituals focused on self and not him. The real reason for the fast should have been lamenting the absence of God's presence as they languished in Babylon for 70 years. God went on to state something to the effect, nothing new here to say, as you have message of the earlier prophets.
What was the message of the earlier prophets?
Was it to treat one another justly, love your neighbors, and care for the vulnerable, like the widows, the orphans, the stranger, and the poor?
Yes, Todd, and that leads to the second response, which explains why the people were in such a fix at this time. Their forefathers had heard the messages from the prophets, but they rejected it, and ultimately God. Zechariah describes their rejection as turning the shoulder, stopping their ears, hardening their hearts like adamant stone, very hard.
Their rejection resulted in God's judgment, described as a whirlwind scattering them to the four winds, their land left desolate and without God's presence.
I would imagine these messages would have been very heavy for the recipients to hear.
Yeah, Jamie, but as often occurs, there's a positive shift after words of judgment, and that leads us into the third response from Zechariah. He expresses God's heart for his people Israel. He was zealous and jealous for them. He would fight for them. He promised to return to Jerusalem and dwell with his people.
That's where he describes a future picture where the aged were present, even up to a high age, and the youth were playing in the streets with joy. That describes a healthy community that was safe and vibrant.
Zechariah also makes the statement that God will dwell with his people and they will be his people and he will be their God. This sounds like a renewal of God's promise to be present with his people and use them to bless others.
Sure does, Jamie. But it even gets better. In the fourth message, where Zechariah directly addresses the original question posed by the delegation from Bethel, speaking for God, he essentially says, if you become what I desire, your fasts will become feasts. He goes on to describe a beautiful picture of God dwelling with his people as they walk in obedience, drawing many to seek him.
What was the statement about 10 men grasping the robe of a Jew?
One commentary stated that the number 10 is a representation of completeness, a prediction there will be a multitude of Gentiles joining in God's family.
Has this already happened, or is this something that's yet in our future?
I think it has happened, at least in part, as we see the impact of Pentecost in the book of Acts and the early church growing and including Gentiles. Even today, Christ's church continues to grow, reaching out to all nations. Ultimately, it appears there's even a further fulfillment at Christ's second coming. But this is something our listeners can research and meditate upon this week.
Let's talk about chapter 9. Jamie, we had a conversation earlier, and you were excited about what you found in your research. I've been wondering, how does Alexander the Great tie into this week's reading?
This was so interesting, you guys. But first, I'm curious what you both know about Alexander the Great.
Well, Jamie, not much.
Yeah, me neither.
I'm guessing you're not alone, because when I asked my friends and family, only a few people knew what he was known for.
Yeah, wasn't he a Greek king?
Yes, he was.
I'm sure he wasn't born with the name Alexander the Great. How did that come about?
I'm glad you asked, Steve, because this is where chapter 9 comes in. Alexander the Great got his name from conquering numerous cities, empires, and regions.
So I'm guessing the cities we read about in the first 8 verses were all taken over by him?
Yes. Many scholars believe that these verses are a roadmap of Alexander's conquests.
Okay, let's talk about Tyre. At the time of Zechariah, wasn't it a rich coastal merchant city?
Yes, it was apparently unconquerable at the time. The Assyrians had tried to take it over and battled for 5 years, but never conquered it. Then the Babylonians battled 13 years, but Tyre withheld their siege too.
So when the people heard Zechariah prophesying in verse 4 about Tyre being struck down and devoured by fire, they were probably wondering how that would ever happen.
Yes. So let's fast forward about 200 years to Alexander the Great. He wanted the Greeks to be free from Persian control, so he began his conquest. When he got to Tyre, he was able to overthrow the island in only 5 months. The way he conquered the city is pretty amazing, so for anyone who enjoys a little research, look into that.
In verses 5 and 6, we see the Philistine cities reference. Jamie, you mentioned a roadmap. After Alexander conquered Tyre, did he move on to the Gaza Strip?
Yep. And next on the list would be Jerusalem. But we see in verse 8 that God's presence would be there, so no one would be able to get into the city.
So did Alexander attempt taking Jerusalem?
This is my favorite part. According to a Jewish historian named Josephus, the high priest at the time, heard about Alexander's conquest.
Can you imagine how scary that would be?
No, I cannot. But according to Josephus, the Lord gave a message to the high priest and told him not to be afraid. He told him to put on his high priestly garments and have all the people dress in white robes. When Alexander came toward the city, they needed to march out to greet him. The high priest obeyed. As Alexander approached, he dismounted his horse, walked up to the high priest, and got down on his knees.
Man, I wonder what his army thought when they saw that.
I know. One of his commanders came up to him after and asked Alexander why he worshipped the priest. Alexander responded, "I did not adore him, but the God who has honored him with that high priesthood." He also said that before he began his military campaign, the Lord gave him a message. When he approached Jerusalem, he would see people in white robes coming out of the city, and he was to respond with grace. Alexander ended up spending the night in the city, made a deal with the high priest, and left the city peacefully.
Whoa, that's incredible.
I know. Now take a look at verse 9.
Verse 9 tells the people to rejoice and shout because a humble king is coming with salvation and riding on a donkey.
That sounds like a reference to Palm Sunday to me.
Sure does, Todd. Jesus references this verse in Matthew 21, verse 5, right before his triumphal entry into Jerusalem.
And it's interesting that this verse comes right after the historical account of Alexander coming into Jerusalem peacefully.
Would this be an example of the law of double reference, since salvation can also mean deliverance, and Alexander came into the city with deliverance?
Yes, Todd, I think it could be. Alexander the Great would be the short-term prophecy fulfillment, and Jesus would be the greater long-term and ultimate fulfillment.
Thanks for tuning in this week. Join us next time to finish out the book of Zechariah. Some exciting chapters are ahead, and you won't want to miss it.